Okay, really early today. It's quarter to 11 in the morning here. I think this is the earliest one I've done, but that's going to just work better into my day. So I'm going to do my devotional now at this time, wherever you are. I know most people watch the devotional after the streaming anyways, but wherever you are, bless you, and hope that you're having a good day. We're going to do verse 26 of chapter 3 of Proverbs. We're working our way through. We're at verse 26. So we're gonna look at that today. It's interesting in the first few chapters of Proverbs, there's a lot of large statements, so multiple verses that are all connected to each other. Later in Proverbs, especially when you get past chapter 10, there's a lot of just proverbial statements, like singular statements that are one verse long. And so for most of the study, that's how it will work. But our study of these, especially in these early chapters, there's a lot of like, well, you need to know the context and you need to know the verses around it. So I'm going to read two verses, but we're going to focus on verse 26. But I'm going to read verse 25 as well. And that connects. So if you want to hear some of the insights on that, you can look at yesterday's video. But here we go. So verse 25 says, "Do not be afraid of sudden fear, nor of the onslaught of the wicked when it comes." And then verse 26 says, "For the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught." Now, the idea there, what the verse, of course, talking about, the idea of being able to not be afraid, right? You can have fear. Certainly, you can be afraid of fear itself. You can have fear about the onslaught of the wicked, things that can happen to you in life. What am I going to do? How am I going to live? How am I going to get through things? And I'm really afraid about all the unexpected things that could happen, the what ifs of life. And so yesterday I was saying, so don't be afraid of that. God's with you is the idea. And so in verse 26 just follows that idea that the Lord will be your confidence. You can have a confidence facing all this stuff because God's with you, and He'll keep your foot from being caught. That's kind of a way of saying you won't trip. You're not going to fall down, right? You won't trip. Just keep walking the path. God won't let you trip up. Now, yesterday we talked a lot about how God gives us a confidence. We don't have to live in a rhythm of fear, a life rhythm. So we're talking about life rhythms. These last number of verses and the ones to come, we're going to be talking about these rhythms of life, ways of life, and the flow of life that we have. And we don't have to live in a broken rhythm of being afraid of everything all the time. So we talked about that yesterday. And we focused a lot on the idea of how God can help prevent harm, but we talked a lot about how He can take you through the danger, and so that you don't have to fear the danger, because even if you have to suffer under it, God can get you through that. So that was yesterday. Today, we're going to focus a little more heavily on the other side of that, which is that God can actually prevent the harm at all. That is a thing as well. And even though we talk a lot, and we will continue to in Proverbs, about all the ways that God gets us through hard times, there's also a truth that following God's ways results in less hard times. That God has a way of actually preventing the hardship itself as well. Not always, because sometimes it's His will that we go through hard things. There's a value to going through very hard things, but He also protects us from some things. And I'll have to say, in my own life, I can testify. I have witnessed many times that God has spared people from harm. I'm well aware of many times where people were on the edge of death, and there is no physical explanation for why they came through it, whether it be a sickness or out of some sort of terrible accident or literal violence being thrown at them, like in some cases from weapons. And yet they've been spared, and many times. And as a pastor and interacting with a lot of people over my life, hundreds, thousands probably of people over my life, my ministry, and the stories I've heard and the testimonies I've heard of people who would say very happily, if they were sitting here next to me, they would say very happily, "Listen, this happened to me, and I should have died. I don't know how I lived apart from God. I can't see any way why I'm still here." And many, many people over the years have given that testimony. And I myself can say that. More than once in my life, I have been in a situation where honestly, I should be dead. And literally physically dead. And a miracle happened, something just completely unexplainable in the normal human physical sense. something beyond that happened. And so there's a thing here. I just want to say, we can have a certain confidence facing fears because God can get us through it. But we can also have some confidence that if God wills it, he can actually spare us from this altogether. And I would actually even argue that God protects us from things, far more things than we're even aware of, that in our lives, God actually supports those that love him, those that are pursuing his paths. He supports that so much that there are things in your life, dangers that you'll never even know were there because he simply fended them off. And that's an amazing thing. That's a confidence you can have in life. That it's quite empowering to think, you know what, I'm going along and I don't even know, but God's around me and surrounding me with his power. And so, if I face hardship, then that's his will and I'm okay. I can go through it. And and then there's probably tons of things happening around you that you don't even know that God has spared you from. At the very least, here's a certainty we can have. Following God's ways results in a life rhythm that we will be spared from self-inflicted tragedy. And this idea of our foot being caught, that we're not going to be the source of our own tragedy because following God's ways will lead you out of that. And so that's a pretty valuable thing. That's no small thing. When you look at the world and all the ways people cause their own harm, it's pretty valuable to think there's a way to prevent yourself from causing your own harm, and that's through the ways of God. All right, let's do our questions. Question number one. What do I mean by self-inflicted tragedy? The word tragedy, I always used to think that was the definition of the word, was self-inflicted tragedy. I've learned since, I guess that's not the meaning, but often that is the case. Tragedy is often, it's a very sad or terrible outcome. Some bad thing happens to somebody. That's tragedy. But often they are self-inflicted. It's a bad thing that happened to us because we did something to ourselves. We harmed ourselves, or we made choices that led to the harm of ourselves, or we didn't make choices that would have saved us from the harm of ourselves. And so in a sense, we become the authors of our own harm. And that's what I'm talking about. When we learn rhythms of life that are just bad choices, it does result in a misery to ourselves. And often this shows up in our life by what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, or what the Bible just talks about, these two forces that pulling the flesh and the spirit, or what fiction writers have pictured as the little angel and the little devil sitting on your shoulder, right? And we have these times in our life where we are torn between, I want this, but this is what's right. But what's right isn't what I want. I want this thing instead, but I still want to be right. And so we have this struggle in our mind about which to choose. And when we learn the ways of God, we will increasingly choose the right in spite of what we want, which is not very fun. It can sometimes even come across as suffering. There's sacrifice of, I didn't get to have this or whatever, but I did the right thing. And often in our life, we'll do the opposite. We'll say, you know what? We'll try and find a way to justify doing the thing we want to do and still try and find a way to call it the right thing. I don't think it really matters if whatever. And we'll come up with some, everybody's doing it, or what else could I do? And we come up with reasons to justify our bad choice. And we end up in misery and hardship because we've made a bad choice. And that's the struggle. And so self-inflicted tragedy comes when we abandon the ways of God and we follow the pursuits of our appetites, and it ends up being very tragic for us. Quite often, it's small tragedies, but quite often it's very large ones, and entire lives, the entire life course of people can be set on fire by deciding not to follow God's ways. And so that's kind of what that's about. Question 2. Those decisions are usually very harmless, aren't they? So this idea that those decisions to not follow God's ways that cause little tragedy, they're mostly just harmless, right? It's just some of them are really big, right? Isn't that right? That's what some people think. That's part of the process that a lot of people go through with the little angel and devil, right? Is the devil speaks in your ear and says, listen, you don't have to follow God's ways. It's boring. It's not very interesting or whatever. And really, it's only a small thing anyway. And that's just a way we try to justify ourselves, but it's not true. There's no such thing as a small evil. All evils are bad. All evils are big. Even if the direct consequence of an action, of an ungodly action, even if the direct consequence isn't horrible, the long-term one is. So all sin leads ultimately to corruption and death. All of it. Every bit of it. And so when we decide to start on a road, so if you remember now back in chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Proverbs, it warned us about the adulteress, right? The one that would draw us away from Lady Wisdom, who we're supposed to be with. Draw us away. And what does it say? All her paths lead to death. And there's this idea, it's just a path. No one starts at the end of the journey, of any journey. We all start at the beginning. And that beginning step is small, right? No one starts out being, a terrible mass murderer. They start with something smaller, and they build to that end. No one wakes up one morning out of the blue and decides to become an adulterer. They start with some sort of lust or some sort of temptation, and they start the journey. And so even those little places where we think this is a pretty harmless place to just not do God's will, you're opening yourself up to, and you're starting a step on a journey that leads to death, leads to tragedy, leads to harm to yourself. And so if you don't do that, if you say with God's ways, you can have a confidence that whatever does come, at least I'm not going to be the cause of my own demise. I'm not going to be the inflictor of my own harm. And so that's good. I'm not going to trip up on things because I'm going to follow God's ways. Question 3. Am I saying, question might be, am I saying that God's protection comes from our obedience? And I am kind of saying that, but I am definitely saying that, but I'm also saying, I'm not entirely saying that. God is merciful and gracious, and God actually will give mercy to people without merit. He like, for instance, one famous verse in the Bible says he sends his rain, to water our crops. He sends rain on both the righteous and the wicked. He does. There's a graciousness to him that he'll do that. But the Bible also says repeatedly that those that follow God's ways, God takes special care of them. He watches over them. He endorses and supports their path because they've chosen to follow the righteous path. So God's protection doesn't get earned from our obedience, but it is given mostly through our obedience. God does sometimes take care of people who don't deserve it, and he does things for them as well. He does, because he's just that kind of God. He's really gracious. But there is consequence to evil, and God does make sure that consequence is applied. And there's consequences to living righteously, and God makes sure those consequences are applied. He watches over us. So obedience is really important. And in the very least, in the area of self-inflicted harm, God will help you avoid that. So it's really worth it. Question 4, how does this apply to the rhythms of fear? So when we're talking about the rhythms of life, once again, yesterday I was talking about trusting God, even if you have to go through a hardship. And today I just want to kind of encourage you, if you're living your life following God's ways, you can also have some confidence that, God can and does prevent much harm in my life. And even if I don't see it, I can be positive that God's at work to make everything work together for good in my life, because I love him and he's called me. And so he's working everything in my life to good somehow. So there's protections around me that wouldn't be there if I didn't love him, if I wasn't following his ways. And there's protections that I may not even be aware of, and what God is doing to help me in my life. And so not only can he take me through hardship, he can actually beat it off as well. And so I can go through the valley of the shadow of death without fearing the evil. And I can go through life not worrying about the wolves either, because his rod and his staff, they comfort me, right? And so that's the idea. So there it is. Today, do you have confidence that God is watching over you? That's the question for you. Do you have confidence of that? If you feel that you lack that confidence, I encourage you, keep pursuing God's ways, and you'll find your confidence grows, that God will help you find victory over the fears, the broken rhythms of fear in your life. God bless us as we pursue you and pursue these things. In Jesus' name. Tomorrow, God willing, we will be on to verse 27, and we'll look at the next broken rhythm that we sometimes fall into. God bless.